The river still looks calm when it takes you. Above Niagara's Horseshoe Falls, the last kilometer accelerates to 40 kilometers an hour, and the crest runs near 110. The fastest swimmer alive manages 8 for seconds. In 2011, a student, Ayano Tokumasu, fell in 24 meters above the brink, inside a distance no rescue on Earth can cover. 168,000 cubic meters a minute, dropping 57 meters. First answer? Too fast. That answer is wrong. It can't explain why a 7-year-old lived, or why the same trap closed in 1912, 1918, 1960, 1995, 2003, 2017. The river that does this spends most of its length being completely ordinary. Niagara runs about 58 kilometers from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, and for the first 35 of them, it behaves like a working waterway. It is wide, in places more than a kilometer across. It splits around Grand Island, carries small boats and water skiers, passes marinas and launch ramps and backyards with docks, and it drops so little over that distance that the slope is invisible to the eye. People fish it, people swim at the sheltered edges of it. Nothing about the Upper Niagara warns anyone, because for most of its length there is nothing to warn about. That is the first thing worth fixing in your head. The danger is not spread along this river. It is concentrated at the end of it. And it switches on inside a distance shorter than a commercial runway. What changes is the bed underneath. Above the head of the rapids, the riverbed stops being a broad, flat trough and starts falling away. Across the last kilometer or so before the horseshoe, the bed drops something on the order of 15 meters. That is a waterfall in its own right, laid down flat. The water doesn't pile up because there is nowhere to pile it. It converts height into speed. And it does that inside a stretch you could walk in 12 minutes. Speed is only half of it. The channel narrows as it turns, the flow is forced toward the Canadian side, and the last few hundred meters are studded with shoals, submerged ledges of dolostone, some of them within centimeters of the surface. Those shoals do two things at once. They break the bottom out of anything with a hull, and they give a person in the water something to hit, catch a foot on, and be folded over by a current that does not stop pushing. Translate 40 kilometers an hour into what it costs you. That is about 11 meters every second. Ayano Tokumasu went into the water roughly 24 meters above the brink. 2 seconds. Not 2 seconds to be rescued. 2 seconds from the moment she was in the water to the moment there was no more water to be in. There is no boat, no rope, no swimmer, no helicopter, no reaction time anywhere in that number. The distance was not the problem. The distance was already gone. Now the part that makes this place genuinely deceptive rather than merely dangerous. Fast water announces itself with noise and standing waves and broken white surface. The Upper Niagara does that only at the very end, in the Cascade Rapids, where the bottom is already gone. Above that, the same volume of water moving at serious speed can run smooth and dark and almost silent because the channel is deep and the bed is even. Smooth water reads as slow water. There are no banks flashing past to give you a reference, no wake, nothing to measure against. A person standing at the edge upstream of the rapids is looking at a surface that gives back none of the information they need, and they are usually looking at it from a lawn or a paved walkway or a low stone wall, in a place that has been landscaped to feel like a park, because it is one. Winter rewrites the same geography without changing any of it. Lake Erie is shallow, and when it freezes, the wind drives broken ice down into the head of the Niagara in quantities that can choke the intakes and jam the channel, which is why there is a steel ice boom strung across the lake outlet at Buffalo every December. A barrier built not to protect people, but to protect power generation and keep the river running. Below that, spray freezes onto everything within reach of the falls. railings, steps, the walkways, the rock of the gorge. The surfaces people stand on become the least reliable part of the site precisely when the water below them is at its most lethal, because cold water strips grip strength and coordination out of a body in minutes. Every winter incident in this river is really two clocks running at once, the current and the temperature. So the first answer, it's too fast, is true and useless. It predicts that everyone who ends up in this river dies. That isn't what the record says. People have gone over these falls and walked away. People have been pulled out with meters to spare. And a steel scow with 2 men on it stopped dead inside the last 600 meters and stayed there for a century. Speed alone explains none of that. The people who knew this river first didn't try to solve it. They went around it. Long before any European saw the falls, the route past this stretch of water was a land route, and the Haudenosaunee and the nations before them worked it as a portage, a carry of roughly 12 kilometers up the escarpment and around the entire gorge. What matters is not that the portage existed. What matters is where it started and stopped. The lower landing was at Lewiston, well below the gorge, and the upper landing was up around what became Fort Schlosser and Chippewa, several kilometers above the brink. Not just above the falls, but above the head of the rapids. The takeout was set by the last point at which a loaded canoe could still make the shore, not by the last point at which the water looked safe. That is a functioning observation system, refined over generations, encoded as a place you get out. Europeans used the same carry because they had no choice. When La Salle wanted a ship on the upper lakes in 1679, he could not sail one up past the falls, so the Griffin was built above them, at Cayuga Creek. Everything moving between the lakes had to be unloaded, carried, and reloaded. That was expensive, slow, and it worked. And the entire commercial history of this river, since then, has been an attempt to stop doing it. The Welland Canal took the shipping. The power companies took the water. Tourism took the shoreline and put a railing on it. Each of those moved people closer to the edge on a schedule the river had no part in setting, and none of them changed the distance in which the river takes control. On the afternoon of July 9, 1960, that distance was about to be measured by a 7-year-old. James Honeycutt was 40, working on the Robert Moses Power Project, and he had a 12-foot aluminum boat with a small outboard on the back. He took 2 of his neighbor's children out on the upper river, Deanne Woodward, 17, and her brother Roger, 7. It was hot. The river above Grand Island was doing what it always does up there, which is nothing at all. Honeycutt handed Roger a life jacket. Deanne and Honeycutt were not wearing one. That detail is not carelessness. It was the ordinary practice of the time on calm water in a small boat, and it is the single reason this story has a survivor. Several kilometers above the falls, the motor lost drive. Accounts point to a sheared pin at the propeller. On a lake, that is an annoyance. Here it removed the only thing holding the boat's position against a current that had been carrying them the whole time without appearing to. Honeycutt worked on the motor. The boat kept going. There is a specific and horrible quality to that phase. Nothing is happening violently. The shore is visible. The water is still smooth, and the situation is already unrecoverable in a way that is not yet obvious to anyone in the boat. They came into the broken water above the brink, and the boat struck a shoal and went over. All 3 were in the river. Honeycutt and Deanne could swim. Roger, in an adult life jacket, was carried into the main flow toward the center of the horseshoe. Deanne fought toward the Canadian shore and got close enough that people on the bank could see her, and 2 men on the rail, John Hayes, a tourist, and John Quattrocchi, got a grip on her arms and hauled her out of the water an estimated 6 meters from the edge. 6 meters. At that speed, half a second of margin. James Honeycutt went over and did not survive. Roger Woodward went over the Horseshoe Falls in a life jacket, fell 57 meters, went into the plunge pool, and came up alive. The Maid of the Mist, too, was working the basin below. Her crew saw him. They brought the boat around and threw a life ring. It missed. Threw again. Missed. On the third throw, he caught it, and they pulled him aboard with cuts and bruises and no serious injury. That is a boat crew doing their actual job under conditions no drill covers, and it is worth being blunt about what it proves. Roger Woodward did not survive because he did anything. He was 7. He survived because he was buoyant, because he had less mass to accelerate over that drop than an adult, and because the current happened to deliver him to the deepest part of the pool instead of the shallow, rock-strewn part. Survival here is trajectory and flotation. Skill is not on the list. Look at where the help came from. Every element of the rescue that worked sat below the falls. The Maid of the Mist is a tour boat, moored in the basin, and in 1960 she was the only vessel on the entire river capable of reaching a person in the water at all. And she could only reach them after they had already gone over. Above the brink, there was nothing except 2 tourists with their hands. That is the structural fact underneath every incident in this story. The rescue asset is on the far side of the event. For anyone in the upper rapids, rescue does not begin until the falls has finished, unless you can reach them with a rope. In 1918, they tried exactly that, in daylight, on a target that wasn't moving, with a city watching from the shore. It took a full day and a night, and it nearly cost the man who went out to fix it. On August 6, 1918, a flat-bottomed steel dumping scow was under tow in the upper river, part of the dredging work that fed the construction going on around the power stations. 2 men were aboard, Gustav Lofberg, 51, and Harris, 53. Contemporary reports give his first name as Frank, later accounts often as James, and that disagreement has never been cleanly resolved. The tug Hasayampa had them. Routine work on water they had crossed many times. The tow parted. The scow was suddenly a hull with no engine, no steering, and no useful anchor, drifting broadside toward the brink from something like 1.5 kilometers out. 2 men, a few minutes, and 1 asset. The boat itself was designed to dump its load through doors in the bottom. They opened the dumping doors and let the river in. Think about what that decision actually is. They were being carried toward a 57-meter drop, and their response was to deliberately flood their own vessel, to make it heavier, to drive it down onto the rocks they were being swept across, to trade floating for grounding. It worked. The scow settled onto the shoals and stopped roughly 600 meters above the crest, and it stopped so thoroughly that it is still there, which converted one emergency into another. They were now safe from the falls and completely unreachable. Tugs tried to work upstream towards them and were pushed back. That is not timidity. It is arithmetic. A tug going up to a stranded hull has to make headway against the flow, meaning its propellers must beat the current and still have thrust left over for steering and for holding station once it arrives. In water running at 10 or 11 meters a second over ledges that will take the bottom out of a hull, a working river tug of 1918 had nothing left over. A lifeboat put out anyway and capsized. Darkness came down over 2 men standing on a flooded hull in the middle of a river nobody could cross, and the crowd on both banks grew into the thousands, which is its own kind of pressure on the people trying to organize something. Consider what the 2 men were actually doing during those hours, because it is the least dramatic and most punishing part of the whole event. Standing on a flooded steel deck, in wet clothing, with no food and nothing to drink, 600 meters of rapids on every side, unable to sit down properly, unable to sleep, and unable to know whether the hull under them was going to hold or take one more shift across the rock and keep going. They had bought themselves time by sinking their own boat, and time was now the thing working against them, because the longer the scow sat there, the more the river had to work at it. The answer had to come from above the water. A United States Coast Guard crew from the Youngstown station brought a Lyle gun, a small line-throwing cannon built for surf rescue, designed to put a light line across a wrecked ship from a beach. They set it up on the roof of the Toronto powerhouse on the Canadian bank, the nearest solid high structure with a clear shot, and fired. The line reached the scow. From that thin line the men hauled out a heavier one, and from that a hawser, and on the hawser the crews rigged a breeches buoy, a ring with canvas legs, running on a rope, which is how you take a man off a wreck when no boat can come alongside. The rigging fouled. In the dark, the ropes snarled in the block, and the whole apparatus locked up, out over the rapids, out of reach. At 3 a.m, William Red Hill Sr. went out on the rope hand over hand. Hill was a riverman with a long record in the gorge, and he was going out over water that had already turned back a tug and a lifeboat, in darkness, on a line that had already jammed. He worked at the snarl and could not clear it, and came back. At 8:30 a.m, he went out again in daylight, got to within roughly 40 meters of the scow, and from that position shouted instructions across to Lofberg and Harris, who then cleared the tangle themselves from their end. The breeches buoy ran. Both men came off alive. Accounts of the total time differ. The figures usually given run from about 17 hours to nearly 30. And the disagreement mostly comes from where you start counting. The relevant number is not the duration. It is the 600 meters. 600 meters of open water in full daylight, with 2 men standing still on a stable platform, and the only method that worked was a rope fired from a rooftop and a rescuer who had to put himself inside the same hazard to make the equipment function. There is no version of this in which a boat comes and gets you. The scow held. So here's the question that should be bothering you. A steel hull stopped in this water and stayed for a century. Why can't a person? Because almost everything that saved the scow is unavailable to a body. The scow had mass, a flat bottom, a draft that let it sit down on rock, and 2 men who could increase its weight on demand. A human being in fast water has none of that. Worse, the force the river applies rises with the square of the speed. Water at 3 meters per second doesn't push half as hard as water at 6. It pushes a quarter as hard. Wading water at walking pace is manageable. The same depth at 11 meters per second is not a stronger version of the same experience. It is a different physical category, and it arrives with a bed made of ledges that catch a foot and hold it while the rest of you goes over. Standing up is not an option that gets harder. It stops being an option. That is the upper river. The falls itself is 57 meters away from all of it, and there is an assumption buried in everything so far worth pulling out, that the danger ends at the drop, that below the falls, the river has spent itself. On February 4th, 1912, about 35 people were standing on the frozen surface of the river below the falls, and they had every historical reason to believe they were somewhere safe. The ice bridge formed most winters. Spray freezing, floes packing in. The whole basin locking into a floor solid enough to walk across from one country to the other. It had been done for decades. Vendors put shanties on it and sold food and photographs. It was a public attraction with a long safety record, and that record was the problem, because it had trained everybody to read the ice as ground. An ice bridge is not a sheet. It is a raft of floes, packed together and frozen at the joints, floating on a river that never stops moving underneath it, and it is held in place by nothing except friction against the gorge walls and its own jammed geometry. That means it does not fail gradually. It fails at the joints, all at once, when the pack loosens enough to start turning. It broke, there was a sound, and then movement, and the people on it had to decide in seconds whether what they had just felt was the ordinary shifting they had heard on the ice before or something different. The floor came apart from shore and began traveling downstream toward the Whirlpool Rapids, carrying people on separate pieces that were also drifting away from each other. Most got off. Ignatius Roth and Burrell Heacock, 17, were close to safety when Heacock turned back. Behind them, Eldridge Stanton and his wife Clara were falling behind, and Clara could not keep up. Heacock went back for them. That decision cost him the margin he had. The rescue attempt was vertical. Firefighters got onto the bridges spanning the gorge above and lowered ropes into the moving ice. This is help arriving at the correct place at the correct time, which almost never happens in this story, and it still failed. Heacock reached a rope and got his hands on it and held. A person hanging from a fixed rope in moving water is not resting. They are the anchor point for the entire force of the current on their body, and that force scales the same brutal way. He lost his grip. The Stantons reached a rope as well, and Eldridge worked to get it secured around Clara. The line failed before they could be lifted. Accounts of the exact sequence differ between the contemporary papers and later retellings, including the ages given for the victims. 3 people died. The rope was directly overhead, 60 meters straight up, with trained men on the other end of it, and the river still set the clock. Walking on the ice bridge was prohibited after 1912, and it has never been permitted since. Note carefully what that prohibition did. It removed one way of being exposed. It did not touch the mechanism. The water below the falls still accelerates into the rapids, and the gorge still has no shoreline you can drive to. So why do people keep arriving? Because this drop is worth an enormous amount of money, and always has been. 57 meters of head with that volume behind it is one of the best hydroelectric sites on the planet. Generations started here in the 1880s and never stopped. By the middle of the 20th century, both countries were building on a scale that required a formal agreement about how much water each could take, and in 1950 they signed one. The Niagara Treaty sets what has to stay in the river for the falls itself, roughly 2,832 cubic meters per second during daylight hours in the tourist season, and half that, around 1,416 are decent at night and out of season. Everything above those floors can go to the turbines. At night in winter, more than half the river can be somewhere else. That created an aesthetic problem. Take that much water out and the falls goes patchy. Dry rock at the flanks, all the flow bunched in the middle. So in the 1950s, they built the International Control Works, a submerged weir upstream in the Chippewa Grass Island Pool, with movable gates designed to redistribute the remaining flow evenly across the crest line. The point was to make a reduced river look like a full one from the viewing platforms. It worked. And this is the reversal that most people never hear. The falls you photograph is a managed appearance. The volume is regulated to a schedule tied to tourist hours, and spreading a smaller flow evenly across the full width of the crest means the water lying over the lip is thinner than it used to be. Depth at the center of the horseshoe crest before the major diversions is commonly reported at around 3 meters. The very small figures you see quoted for the crest today come mostly from tourism material, rather than published hydrological survey, so treat the precise number with suspicion. But the direction is not in doubt. Less water, spread wider, is a shallower sheet over the rock lip. That matters because the lip is where a body crosses. Thinner water at the crest means less cushion between a person and the edge of the dolostone, and it means more contact with rock at the one moment when contact with rock decides everything. The engineering that protected the view reduced the depth at exactly the point of no return. It also slowed the erosion that had been cutting the crest back at roughly a meter a year, which is why the falls has largely stopped retreating upstream. Better for the landscape, worse for anyone crossing the edge. Nothing was made safer. It was rearranged. The same period did something else to this river that no treaty article covers. It filled the banks with people. The Canadian shore above the falls is a continuous landscaped promenade running for kilometers upstream, and at Table Rock, it brings the public to the lip of the horseshoe itself. Not to a viewpoint across a valley, but to the crest, close enough to be wet. On the American side, the walkways run out over the Cascade Rapids and down to the very edge at Terrapin Point. Between a visitor and 40-kilometer-an-hour water, there is a stone wall or a metal railing about a meter high, and a sign. Somewhere between 12 and 14 million people come through here in a year. That is the whole safety system in the upper river, a barrier and a warning, because nothing downstream of it can help. Every other hazardous site on this scale has a second layer, a patrol boat, a net, a recovery point further on. This one has a railing, and then it has the falls. Everything after the crest is decided by what is underneath. The horseshoe basin is deep. The plunge pool at the base is generally given as around 35 meters. And it is deep because a century of falling water excavated it. That depth is the entire reason anybody has ever survived this. The American Falls does not have it. In 1931, and far more dramatically in 1954, when a large section of rock collapsed at Prospect Point, the base of the American Falls filled with talus, a slope of broken boulders piled up to a third of the height of the drop. Water falls onto rock there. There is no pool to arrive in. Even the good option is hostile. Falling water drags enormous volumes of air down with it, and the plunge pool is not water so much as a churning mixture of water and entrained air. Aerated water is less dense. A body that floats, normally, floats badly in it, and a life jacket that would hold you at the surface of a lake holds you lower here. The same descending column that carries the air down also sets up a recirculation that pushes anything at the base back toward the fall. And the water is cold, a few degrees above freezing for a large part of the year, which means that even a person who has done everything the physics requires now has a clock running on their hands, their grip, and their ability to follow instructions from a rescuer. Roger Woodward came up in the deep center of the horseshoe pool in July. Change any one of those variables, and there is no story. None of which stopped anybody. In October 1901, Annie Edson Taylor, 63, went over the horseshoe in a padded wooden barrel and came out with a cut on her head, and from that moment the falls had a demonstrated survival method, which is a genuinely dangerous piece of information to release into the world. Barrels and steel drums and rubber balls followed for a century. Some worked. Several killed the person inside. One of them belonged to a family already in this story. On the 5th of August 1951, William Redhill Jr., son of the man who had gone out on the rope over the rapids in 1918, went over the horseshoe in a device he called the Thing. 13 inner tubes, bound together with canvas webbing and netting. It was light, it floated, and it had nothing rigid about it. It came apart in the pool. He did not survive. The man who had proved in 1918 that a rescue here means rope, shore, and a human being inside the hazard had a son who tested the pool with rubber and canvas and lost. Equipment kept getting better, and that turns out to be the trap rather than the solution. On the 1st of October 1995, Robert Overacker rode a jet ski up the upper river toward the brink at speed. He had a rocket-deployed parachute strapped to him. The plan was precise and, on paper, entirely coherent. Cross the crest on the ski, release it, fire the rocket, deploy the canopy, and descend into the basin under it. He was doing it to draw attention to homelessness. There were cameras. He went over the edge exactly as intended, released the ski, and the rocket fired. The parachute did not open. The harness attachment failed. He fell to the base of the falls in front of a live audience and was recovered by the Maid of the Mist crew, who once again found themselves doing the only job available at the bottom of this drop. He was pronounced dead at hospital. The river did not defeat the parachute. It never had to. It only had to be there while a piece of equipment failed on its own, which is what equipment does. That is the pattern worth holding onto. Every device that makes an attempt survivable also makes the attempt thinkable. And every device adds a component that can fail in a place where a single failure is total. Kirk Jones did it without any device at all, which should have ended the argument. On the 20th of October 2003, Jones went into the upper river and over the Horseshoe Falls with no barrel, no ball, no flotation, nothing. He surfaced in the pool and got himself out at the shore with cuts and bruised ribs, no serious injury. He was charged, fined, and barred from Canada. And afterwards he said plainly that he would not do it again, that he had been lucky in a way he could not repeat. He was right about the mechanism and wrong about himself. On the 19th of April 2017, Kirk Jones went over Niagara Falls a second time, this time inside a large inflatable ball. The ball was found floating below the falls, empty and torn, near the Maid of the Mist. His body was recovered on the 2nd of June 2017 from the river near Youngstown, roughly 19 kilometers downstream. Reported dimensions of the ball vary between accounts, and whether he was still inside it when it went over the crest has never been established. The comparison between his two attempts is as clean an experiment as this river will ever give anybody. Unprotected, he survived. Protected, he did not. A sealed inflatable sphere has buoyancy, which sounds like an advantage until you put it in aerated recirculating water at the base of a 57-meter fall, where buoyancy holds you in the churn instead of letting you sink out of it and drift clear, and where being inside a closed shell means you cannot swim, cannot orient, cannot be reached, and cannot get out. The thin sheet of water at the modern crest and the rock at the lip did the rest. Protection here is not a general good. It is a specific bet about which forces you will meet, and the ball bet wrong. Modern rescue is real, and it is worth being precise about what it can and cannot do, because the gap between those two things is where people are still dying. In March 2009, a man went over the Horseshoe Falls and survived the drop. He was in the plunge pool, in water a few degrees above freezing, in the basin below a 57-meter wall of falling water. And the first problem was simply seeing him. Recognition comes from a tourist, a boat crew, or a park employee, because there is no sensor covering that water, then dispatch, then getting to the water at all. The gorge below the falls has no road. The one practical vehicle route down to the Canadian shore of the basin is the Maid of the Mist driveway. And that is the way the crews went in, because it is the only way there is. Rescuers went into the water on lines from that shore, and then the part nobody plans for. He resisted them. For something on the order of 45 minutes, he stayed in near freezing water, refusing help, in a basin where the recirculation keeps pushing anything floating back toward the fall. While rescuers on ropes tried to close a distance, the current kept reopening. What finally worked was a helicopter, and not by lifting him. The aircraft came in low and used its rotor downwash, the column of air a helicopter pushes downward, to drive the surface water and the man on it toward the shore, close enough that the crews on the lines could get hands on him. He was pulled out hypothermic and alive. Every element of that operation was modern, competent, and successful, and every element of it happened after the falls had already decided the outcome. Recognition, dispatch, authorization, access down a tour boat driveway, entry on ropes, 45 minutes of approach, a helicopter improvising with air pressure. In July 2019, a man went over the Horseshoe at around 4 in the morning and was found alive on the rocks near the Journey Behind the Falls platform, again discovered after the fact, again in the basin, again with rescue starting at the bottom. The capability below the falls has improved enormously since 1960. The capability above the brink has not changed at all. because the physics that stopped a tug in 1918 has not changed either. Nobody has built a machine that can hold position in the last 600 meters of the upper Niagara and take a person out of the water. The Lyle gun and the rope were not primitive. They were the correct answer, and they are still the only answer. Put the whole system in one line and it stops looking like a series of accidents. The gradient sets the speed, and the speed arrives silently because deep, smooth channels don't advertise. The shoals remove footing and open hulls at the exact point where the speed has already removed the option of swimming. The treaty and the control work set how thin the water lies over the crest, which decides how much rock a body meets at the edge, and the plunge pool decides whether there is anything to arrive in. Cold decides how long a survivor can cooperate with the people trying to reach them. Money, power, then tourism, puts 12 to 14 million visitors a year within a railing's width of the whole apparatus. And every rescue capability that exists sits below the drop because that is the only place a boat can float and a truck can reach. None of the incidents in this story are variations on one mistake. Honeycutt lost a propeller pin. Lofberg and Harris lost a tow line. Heacock walked on a floor that had held for decades. Overacker's harness failed. Jones brought protection. Tokumasu climbed a railing. Different eras, different equipment, different levels of intent, and the same 600 meters closing behind every one of them. There is a photograph you can take from Table Rock right now that contains the entire argument. Out in the upper rapids, 600 meters above the crest, there is a rusted, flat-bottomed hull sitting on the rocks where two men sank it deliberately in 1918. It held that position for 101 years. Through every winter, every ice run, every flood, every change in flow, the power companies made. On the 31st of October 2019, a storm pushed it about 50 meters downstream and rolled it onto its side, and it stopped again, closer to the edge than before. It is still there. It is still moving. On a schedule nobody controls. And on the railing above it, every day the weather allows, there is a line of people with their phones up, photographing a wreck that proves how far out you can get stuck, standing at the last place on this river where anyone would think to look for danger.